So in an earlier segment, we talked about the Monrovia Feature Film Company and briefly on other studios in Monrovia. I need to make a clarification. I mentioned that the Sante Fe studio was probably located in a large two-story building on Duarte Road. Wrong. I did some later research and realized that that particular building was probably not built until the mid-1940s, so could not have possibly housed the studio. I also was trying to locate another studio that I knew existed briefly in Monrovia, and I was able to track that one down. It was located at an address of 1631 Pine. Now, Pine no longer exists in Monrovia, but Pine was part of the street naming scheme implemented by L.L. Bradbury when he created West Duarte. And it survived much longer than any, well, with the exception of Railroad Avenue and Raymond, which exist to this day. Pine lasted longer than almost any of the other street names. Pine was roughly parallel with Primrose Avenue. It was a north-south street, and it ran south from Central Avenue. So the early addresses are on Pine. Later on, when Primrose was extended south, Pine was renamed Primrose. But in 1928, there was no listing for 1631 Pine. 1930, in the Monrovia City Directory, the listing was the Ibero American Pictures motion picture producers with a principal of Howard B. Snyder, who is listed as living in Los Angeles. I did a little preliminary census checking. I have not been able to track him down yet, but that's something I would like to follow up on. The later directories of 1931 and 32 and 1935 indicates that the location was vacant. And by 1937, the indication in the directories is it was being lived in by a married couple, the Burgess family, with no mention of anything going on having to do with filmmaking there. Years ago, I stumbled across the listing, and I thought, let me take a look. So I went down, drove around that area, and finally found it. And yes, it looked very much like a studio. There was a raised area in back, probably where there was a set, where you could place a set. It was not, it had been used for commercial use, I think. I believe it was fenced off when I found it. Scott Ochoa, former city manager for the city of Monrovia, was aware of the building, had some idea of its history, but preserving it was not on the city's radar screen because that area was scheduled to be redeveloped as Station Square. So in the initial stages of the redevelopment, the building itself was demolished. But the address still exists, 1631 South Primrose. And as I say, it had a very, very brief association with motion pictures. The 1928 Monrovia City Directory lists another studio, the Victor Adamson Productions Inc., with Victor Adamson as president. They're listed as moving picture producers, and their location was not very specific. It simply said in the directory, South Myrtle Avenue at the Sante Fe tracks. So that could have been on the north side of the tracks, probably the north side, because at that point, the tracks themselves are quite close to Duarte Road. That would not have left a large space to work with. So let's say the north side of the Sante Fe tracks at Myrtle Avenue. Two names for that studio. Yesterday's Heritage for Today's Child mentions it in passing as Studio Sante Fe, but in some documentation sent to Myron Hotchkiss by a Mark Wanamaker of Beverly Hills, he refers to it as Sante Fe Studios, and he provided a listing of the officers in 1927. Victor Adamson Productions. I mentioned President Victor Adamson, but it also mentioned the general manager, studio manager, casting, scenic, publicity, etc. So it was a very detailed breakdown of those associated with the Sante Fe studios. It also says it was on Myrtle Avenue in Monrovia. There were some successor companies to the Monrovia Feature Film Company, and Mr. Wanamaker provided those. 1917, the Colorado Film Corporation at the former Monrovia Feature Film Company studio. Empire Motion Picture Company, 1917. So I'm assuming that these are very short-lived usages. So it's safe to say that there was more than one effort at filmmaking in Monrovia, some of longer duration than others, but none of them, of course, lasted until much longer than the 1930s. Might have been a combination of the Depression and competition from Hollywood in terms of filmmaking, and it probably made much more sense to film at a location where there were resources close at hand to aid in filming rather than Monrovia, where there would have been no support systems handy. So that rounds out basically the history of filmmaking in Monrovia. As I say, it was not a single studio effort, probably 3 at the very most, and none of them had a very long lifespan. So, as I believe Wiley summarized, that thus passed Monrovia's opportunity to rival Hollywood as a filmmaking capital.